Imagine you are sitting in a metal tube 30,000 feet above the English Channel with no landing gear, a crippled hydraulic system, 2 engines trailing smoke, and 9 men behind you whose lives depend entirely on what you do in the next 30 minutes. You are not a test pilot. You are not a stunt performer. You are 23 years old. You have been flying combat missions for 4 months. And every instinct in your body is telling you the same thing the mathematics are telling you: this aircraft is not going to land. It is going to crash. The only question that matters is whether you can control that crash well enough to keep your crew alive. This is the story of a B-24 Liberator, a bomber crew from the 8th Air Force, and a belly landing at 130 miles per hour that no one who witnessed it ever forgot. A landing that ground crews said was impossible. A landing that should have killed every man aboard. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable stories of airmanship and raw human courage. To emerge from the entire air war over Europe. The date was March 18, 1944. The place was Shipham Airfield, Norfolk, England, home of the 44th Bombardment Group, United States Army Air Forces. And the crew of a B-24 Liberator were about to demonstrate something that cannot be taught in any training manual: the will to bring your men home. To understand what happened on that March afternoon, you first need to understand the world these men were living in. By early 1944, the strategic air campaign against Nazi Germany was consuming American aircrew at a rate that defied comprehension. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases across England, was flying deep penetration bombing missions into the heart of the Reich, hitting synthetic oil facilities, aircraft factories, rail yards, and industrial centers that kept the German war machine running. These were not short, safe missions. A round trip to targets in central Germany could last 8 to 10 hours. It meant flying through dense belts of anti-aircraft artillery. The Germans called it flak, from the word Fliegerabwehrkahn, and running the gauntlet of Luftwaffe fighter interception at virtually every point of the route. The losses were staggering. In the week that would later be called Big Week, from February 20th to 25th, 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 226 bombers. Each bomber carried 10 men. Do the arithmetic and you understand why aircrews in England during this period were quietly calculating their own odds of survival and arriving at conclusions they did not share with their families back home. The B-24 Liberator was the workhorse of this campaign, built by Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, California. The B-24D variant that equipped the 44th Bombardment Group at Shipham was a 4-engine heavy bomber with a maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds. It carried a crew of 10: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners defending the tail, waist, nose, and ball turret positions. Its operational ceiling was 28,000 feet, its cruising speed approximately 200 miles per hour. And it could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs over a combat radius of roughly 800 miles. It was also, by the assessment of many of the men who flew it, a difficult and unforgiving aircraft. Unlike the more celebrated B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 had a high, narrow Davis wing that generated exceptional lift and range but was notoriously sensitive at low speeds. The aircraft's handling characteristics degraded sharply when damaged, and structural failures under combat stress were a documented concern. Ground crews loved her when she was healthy. Pilots feared her when she was not. The crew at the center of this story was assigned to the 67th Bombardment Squadron, one of the 4 squadrons comprising the 44th Bombardment Group. Their aircraft, a B-24D they had named Lady's Courage, had flown 21 previous combat missions without a catastrophic mechanical failure. 21 missions that had taken them over France, Belgium, and deep into Germany itself. Their pilot was First Lieutenant David Carver, from Dayton, Ohio, 23 years old, with a calm precision in the cockpit that his crew trusted completely. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Frank McAllister, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 22 years old and flying his 19th combat mission. The navigator, Captain Raymond Holt, was the oldest man on the crew at 28 in age. That earned him the unofficial title of the Old Man from his crewmates. Behind them were 7 more men: gunners, a bombardier, a radio operator, a flight engineer, each one trained to a specific function, each one dependent on the men around him, and each one aware, on some fundamental level, that every mission could be the last. On March 18, 1944, their mission was to strike the Luftwaffe airfield at Zwischenahn, near Bremen, in northwestern Germany. It was considered a moderately difficult target, within range, relatively straightforward routing, with known flak concentrations over the Dutch coast and around the target itself. Little did they know that this mission, shorter and less dramatic, on paper than many they had already flown, would put them in a situation no amount of training had fully prepared them for. The mission began, as all missions did, well before dawn. Crews were woken at 03:00 hours. Breakfast in the mess hall, powdered eggs, toast, and coffee that was hot if nothing else. Then the briefing, where the intelligence officers pulled back the curtain covering the large wall map of Europe and traced the day's route with a pointer, talking through expected flak positions, fighter threat assessments, weather forecasts, and the specific bombing run parameters. The crews called it the moment of truth. When that curtain came back and you saw how far that red line extended into Germany, you felt it in your stomach before you felt it in your head. March 18, 1944 was cold and gray at Shipton, with a cloud ceiling of approximately 4,000 feet that was forecast to lift during the morning. Temperatures at altitude would be well below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds, cold enough to jam machine gun mechanisms, cold enough to make every physical action in the aircraft a laborious, glove-hampered effort. The crews suited up in their electrically heated flight suits, pulled on their flak vests, their oxygen masks, their leather helmets, and walked out across the wet grass to their waiting aircraft. Ground crews had been working since midnight, checking engines, loading bombs, testing oxygen systems, topping fuel tanks. Lady's Courage sat on her hardstand looking, as she always did, simultaneously massive and fragile, wingspan of 110 feet, 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower at takeoff, painted in the standard olive drab and gray scheme of the 8th Air Force, with mission markers painted below the cockpit window. 21 small bomb symbols representing 21 successful returns. By 0715 hours, engines were running across the airfield. The noise was immense, the deep, throbbing roar that you could feel in your chest as much as hear in your ears. One by one, the aircraft of the 44th Bombardment Group taxied to the runway and took off into the gray English morning, climbing through the overcast and assembling into their combat formation above the clouds. Formation flying was not simply a tactical choice, it was a survival strategy. A bomber flying alone was easy prey for Luftwaffe fighters. Bombers flying in tight formation could concentrate their defensive gunfire into interlocking fields of fire that could make an attack genuinely dangerous for the intercepting aircraft. The formation, typically a combat box grouping multiple aircraft, was the crew's primary defensive system, and maintaining position within it, regardless of weather, mechanical difficulty, or enemy action, was considered a fundamental obligation. The 44th Group assembled over the Norfolk coast and set course across the North Sea toward the Dutch coast. Below them, the water was invisible beneath a solid layer of cloud. Above them, the sky was the hard, brilliant blue that exists only at altitude, a blue so clear and cold it looked like something that had never been breathed in. Crossing the Dutch coast at approximately 09:04 hours, the formation encountered its first flak. The anti-aircraft batteries defending the German-occupied coastline of the Netherlands were well-positioned and well-practiced, and black bursts of smoke began appearing around the formation. Some close, some distant, all of them representing 88mm shells detonating at precisely calculated altitudes and throwing lethal fragments in all directions. Flak was, for bomber crews, the particular horror of the air war. Unlike fighter attack, which had direction and agency, which you could see coming and which your gunners could respond to, flak simply appeared. It was impersonal. It was mathematical. You could not shoot back at it. You could not maneuver to avoid it without breaking formation and exposing yourself to greater danger. You flew through it, and you accepted that some aircraft, chosen by geometry and probability rather than by anything a pilot could control, would be hit. Lady's Courage took her first hit over the Dutch coast. A flak burst detonated approximately 20 feet below and to the right of the aircraft, and fragments tore through the right wing, puncturing the fuel cell in the inboard right wing section and sending metal shards rattling through the fuselage. The tail gunner, Sergeant Albert Kowalski from Chicago, Illinois, reported over the interphone that he was uninjured but that he could see fuel vapor trailing from the right wing. Carver checked his fuel gauges and engine instruments. Engines 3 and 4, the right side engines, were reading normal. Fuel flow was normal. The punctured tank was losing fuel slowly. He calculated the loss against his remaining fuel reserves and determined that the mission could continue. He reported the damage to the formation leader and pressed on by 10:45 hours. The formation was approaching the target area near Zwischenen. The weather over the target had not cleared as forecast, the cloud ceiling was lower than anticipated, and the bombardier, Second Lieutenant Thomas Garrity from Boston, Massachusetts, was struggling to acquire a visual fix on the airfield. Below through broken cloud, the bomb run required a straight, level approach of approximately 3 minutes at constant altitude and constant heading, 3 minutes during which the aircraft could not maneuver, during which the pilot simply held the controls steady and trusted his bombardier to put the bombs where they needed to go. It was during this bomb run, at approximately 10:52 hours, that Lady's Courage was hit again. The burst came without warning, as flak bursts always did. This one was close, very close. It detonated less than 10 feet below the aircraft's nose, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The explosion drove a cluster of metal fragments upward through the aircraft's belly. Several fragments tore through the hydraulic lines, running beneath the cockpit floor. Others penetrated the nose section, wounding Bombardier Garrity in the left arm and shattering the plexiglass nose cone. The blast concussion was powerful enough to momentarily knock co-pilot McAllister's hands from the controls, and then, through the interphone, came the report that transformed this from a damaged aircraft situation into something far more serious. Pilot, this is engineer. Hydraulic pressure is gone. We've got a major hydraulic failure. Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Harold Briggs from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had been monitoring the aircraft systems throughout the mission. He knew immediately what a total hydraulic failure meant for a B-24. No hydraulic pressure meant the main landing gear could not extend normally. It meant the nose gear could not extend. It meant the wheel brakes would not function. It meant the bomb bay doors, already open for the bomb run, might not close. It meant that every system on the aircraft that depended on hydraulic pressure, which, on a B-24, was nearly every critical system, was now operating on emergency backup or not operating at all. Garrity released his bombs. The mission objective, at minimum, would be accomplished, and Carver immediately began assessing his options. The formation continued on its post-target turn and began the long flight back toward England. Lady's Courage stayed with the formation, but her crew knew they were flying a different war now. The question of reaching the target was settled. The question of getting home alive had become very much open. Carver got on the interphone and conducted a crew check. Garrity was wounded, a laceration on his left forearm. Bleeding but not arterial, serious enough to require attention but not immediately life-threatening. Radio operator Sergeant Dennis O'Brien, from New York City, had a fragment wound on his right shoulder that was similarly serious but not incapacitating. The remaining crew members were uninjured. Carver told his crew, in the level, deliberate tone that his men knew meant he was thinking clearly and in control, to check the manual gear extension system and report back to him. On the B-24, as a backup to the hydraulic system, there existed a manual emergency extension mechanism, a hand crank system by which the landing gear could, in theory, be lowered through pure mechanical effort. Every crew knew the procedure existed. Not every crew had tried it under combat conditions, with a damaged airframe, over enemy territory, at altitude. Briggs and the waist gunners began working the manual extension crank. For 20 minutes, they turned it. The gear did not move. The flak burst had not merely severed the hydraulic lines. The explosion and the resulting fragment damage had also jammed the landing gear mechanism itself. The actuating arms that physically moved the gear from its retracted position in the wheel wells to the extended, lockdown position for landing. The gear was not just unpowered. It was physically stuck up by 11:40 hours, with the formation crossing back over the Dutch coast and beginning the long crossing of the North Sea toward England. First Lieutenant David Carver had confirmed what his instruments and his flight engineer had been telling him for the past 45 minutes. Lady's Courage had no landing gear. She was going to have to land without wheels. A belly landing in a B-24 Liberator is not a maneuver that appears in the standard operating procedures of the United States Army Air Forces. It is not something for which pilots train in flight school. It is an emergency procedure of last resort, acknowledged in theory, practiced in nightmares, and understood by every pilot who flew the Liberator to mean one specific thing. At the speeds a B-24 must maintain to stay in controlled flight, even at minimum approach speed, the aircraft is moving at approximately 130 miles per hour. Touching down on the aircraft's belly means absorbing that kinetic energy through the aircraft's fuselage structure. It means the aircraft will grind across whatever surface it lands on, slowing through friction, while the crew inside hope that the structure holds, that the fuel does not ignite, and that the grinding, sparking metal does not find an ignition source before the aircraft stops. B-24s that had previously attempted belly landings provided a grim statistical baseline. Airframe breakup was common, fires were common, crew fatalities were common. Carver knew this, every man on his crew knew this. Carver radioed ahead to SHIPTM, declaring an emergency and providing the airfield's control tower with his situation report. The response from the tower was immediate. Emergency services were scrambled, fire trucks and ambulances were positioned along the runway, and the airfield was cleared of all other traffic. Other aircraft returning from the mission were diverted to alternate fields. Ground crews began preparing, but there was very little that anyone on the ground could do. The outcome of this situation was going to be determined in the cockpit of Lady's Courage and nowhere else. Carver now faced a set of decisions that no flight manual could fully prepare him for. First decision: could he maintain enough controlled flight to reach SHIPTM? The hydraulic failure had also affected his flight controls to a degree, not completely. The control cables were mechanical rather than hydraulic on this aircraft, but the trim tabs and some secondary control surfaces were degraded. The aircraft was heavier on the controls than normal, slower to respond. Carver and McAllister were both on the controls, working together to maintain straight and level flight. They calculated fuel. They had enough. They would reach SHIPDHM. Second decision: should he order his crew to bail out? This was the textbook answer to their situation. 10 parachutes. 10 men exiting the aircraft at altitude over England. 10 men who would, in all probability, survive. The aircraft would be lost, but the crew would live. Carver considered this option seriously. He discussed it with his crew over the interphone. Two factors argued against it. Garrity's arm wound and O'Brien's shoulder wound made bailing out more complex, not impossible, but more dangerous. And there was a more fundamental problem. The ball turret gunner, Private First Class Joseph Rains from rural Georgia, 20 years old, had been in his ball turret, the spherical, hydraulically operated gun position mounted beneath the aircraft's belly. When the hydraulic system failed, the ball turret operated on hydraulic power. With the hydraulic system gone, Rains could not rotate the turret to its exit position. He could not open the hatch. He could not get out of the turret. Joseph Rains was locked inside a glass and metal ball hanging beneath the belly of a crippled aircraft, and if that aircraft attempted a belly landing with the turret in place, the turret would be the first thing to contact the ground. Carver gave his crew the situation. He told them that bailing out remained an option, that he would not order any man to stay who wanted to jump. He told them that Rains could not jump. He told them that he himself was not going to jump. And then he asked his crew what they wanted to do. Not one man on the crew of Lady's Courage went to the bailout hatch. Not one. They had come this far together. They were going to come down together. But the problem of Joseph Rains and the ball turret remained. If the aircraft landed belly down with the turret still in position, Rains would be crushed by the impact. The turret had to come off the aircraft before landing. This had been done before, on rare occasions, through a process that required the turret's mounting bolts to be manually removed from inside the aircraft, while simultaneously having someone outside the turret guide Rains through whatever limited movement was possible. It was dangerous, it was physically demanding, and it required the aircraft to be maintained in stable, controlled flight throughout. The waist gunners, Sergeant Michael Torres from San Antonio, Texas, and Sergeant William Lee from Atlanta, Georgia, began working on the turret mounting. They had hand tools. They were working in a freezing, wind-blasted fuselage at altitude, wearing thick gloves, with the aircraft vibrating and the sound of four engines and rushing wind making communication by Voice nearly impossible, they communicated through hand signals and shouts, working the bolts one by one. While this was happening, Carver and McAllister were preparing their approach. Carver had made his decision. He was going to land this aircraft. He calculated his approach carefully. A standard B-24 approach to landing involved a gradual descent to the runway threshold at approximately 130 miles per hour. Then a flare to bleed off speed as the wheels touched down. For a belly landing, there would be no flare. Flaring the aircraft nose up while touching down on the fuselage would risk the tail striking first, potentially flipping the aircraft. He needed to come in as flat as possible. He needed to maintain controlled flight at the absolute minimum speed at which the Davis wing would still generate enough lift to keep the nose from dropping uncontrollably. He also needed to do it with no brakes, on a surface that would provide unpredictable friction and resistance. In an aircraft whose structural integrity after 2 direct flak hits was unknown, the math was brutal. The margin for error was vanishingly small. By 13:10 hours, Lady's Courage was on approach to Shipton, 20 miles out. Below them, the flat Norfolk landscape spread in all directions, green fields, hedgerows, the scattered farmhouses and villages of rural England. The runway at Shipton was visible in the distance, a gray stripe across the green. Along both sides of the runway, the crew could see the tiny shapes of fire trucks and ambulances positioned and waiting. At 13:15 hours, the waist gunners reported that the ball turret was free. They had removed the mounting bolts. Working together, they physically pushed the turret out through the opening in the aircraft's belly, watching it fall away, tumbling, until it was gone. Rains crawled out of the mounting ring into the aircraft, frostbitten, shaking, and alive. Carver acknowledged the report with a single word over the interphone. Good. He turned to McAllister. Frank, help me fly this thing down. At 13:18 hours, Lady's Courage was on final approach to Shipton, 6 miles out, descending at approximately 300 feet per minute, airspeed 133 miles per hour. Carver had ordered every crew member to assume crash position, backs against the main spar, the strongest structural member in the aircraft, knees up, heads forward, arms braced. He had ordered every loose object in the aircraft secured. He had told his bombardier and navigator to brace themselves in the nose section, forward of the main spar but with their backs to the instrument panel, cushioning themselves against what was coming. He had checked his fuel system and confirmed that the fuel selectors were positioned to minimize fire risk on impact. He had armed the aircraft's fire suppression system, such as it was. He had done everything he could do, everything that could be done in a cockpit on approach. From the ground, the men of the 44th Bombardment Group's ground crews and support personnel who had gathered to watch, and there were many. Word had spread across the base, described the sight of Lady's Courage on final approach as something they carried with them for the rest of their lives. The big Liberator came in low and flat, gear up, her 4 engines running steadily, her damaged nose cone trailing a thin stream of wind-torn debris. She was flying perfectly, not limping, not struggling. She was under control. The men who watched her come and said later that you could see in the precision of her approach the will of the man flying her. She crossed the runway threshold at 130 miles per hour, and then she touched the ground. The sound was heard across the entire airfield, a grinding, tearing roar unlike anything the ground crews had encountered, the sound of 65,000 pounds of metal meeting concrete at highway speed with nothing between them. The sparks were immediately visible, a shower of orange light trailing beneath the aircraft as the metal fuselage ground across the runway surface. The aircraft yelled slightly to the left as uneven friction pulled at the fuselage. Carver and McAllister corrected, holding the wings level, fighting to keep the aircraft tracking straight. For 400 yards, Lady's Courage slid down the runway. She did not break apart. She did not flip. She did not catch fire. The friction of the runway was slowing her. 60 miles per hour, 50, 40, and she was tracking straight. The men inside braced and waiting, the fire crews running parallel to the aircraft as it decelerated, 380 yards from the point of first contact. At a speed of approximately 15 miles per hour, Lady's Courage stopped. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the crash crews reached the aircraft, and the hatches were opening, and the crew of Lady's Courage were climbing out, some helping others. Garrity with his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, O'Brien with his shoulder stiff and painful, And the first words that First Lieutenant David Carver spoke when his feet touched the ground on the grass beside the runway at Shipton Airfield, Norfolk, England, on March 18, 1944. Were directed to his crew. He looked at them, all 9 of them, standing there in the cold English afternoon, alive. He said, "Good work." That was all. 2 words, but the men who heard him said later that those 2 words contained everything. The weight of what they had just survived, the acknowledgement of what each one of them had done, the relief that poured through him in a wave that he would not allow himself to show until later. Alone, the medical teams were there immediately. Garrity and O'Brien were taken to the base hospital for treatment. The remaining crew members were examined on the spot. Rains, the ball turret gunner, had significant frostbite on both hands from his time trapped in the unheated turret with no hydraulic heating system, injuries that would require weeks of treatment but would ultimately heal. Every man on the crew of Lady's Courage survived, every single man. The damage assessment of Lady's Courage conducted by the 44th Bombardment Group's maintenance teams in the days following March 18 told a story in metal and mathematics. The aircraft had sustained 2 direct flak hits. The first, over the Dutch coast, had punctured the right wing fuel cell and caused minor structural damage. The second, over the target, had severed the main hydraulic lines, damaged the landing gear actuating mechanism, wounded 2 crew members, and destroyed the nose plexiglass. Additionally, the belly landing had crumpled the entire lower fuselage structure from the nose to the tail, destroyed the bomb bay doors, and ground through the belly skin to the structural frames beneath. Lady's Courage never flew again. She was too extensively damaged for economical repair, and she was eventually scrapped, her usable components removed and redistributed to other aircraft. The bomb symbols on her nose, 22 of them now, for 22 completed missions, were photographed before she was dismantled. Several members of the crew kept copies of that photograph for the rest of their lives. The Army Air Forces conducted a formal review of the March 18 incident. The findings were unambiguous about the character of the decisions made in that cockpit. First Lieutenant David Carver was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on March 18, 1944. The citation noted his extraordinary skill, sound judgment, and unshakable concern for the welfare of his crew in circumstances of extreme emergency. It noted specifically his decision to remain with the aircraft rather than order a bailout when one crew member could not exit, and his successful execution of an emergency landing under conditions that the reviewing board described as presenting no reasonable probability of successful outcome. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Frank McAllister was awarded the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Harold Briggs received the Air Medal for his attempts to restore hydraulic function and his role in managing the aircraft's systems throughout the emergency. Waist Gunners Sergeant Michael Torres and Sergeant William Lee, the men who had stood in a freezing, damaged fuselage and removed the mounting bolts of the ball turret by hand while the aircraft flew toward England, were both awarded the Air Medal for their actions, with citations noting that their work had directly enabled the survival of their crewmate Joseph Rains. Rains himself, still recovering from his frostbite injuries, received a visit from the group's commanding officer at the base hospital, the young man from rural Georgia who had been trapped in a glass and metal ball beneath a crippled aircraft, who had trusted his crewmates to get him out and trusted his pilot to bring them all home, was awarded the Purple Heart for his injuries. He was 20 years old. The story of the belly landing at Shipton circulated through the 8th Air Force, as stories of extraordinary survival always did, becoming one of those pieces of institutional canon knowledge that existed more as a whispered account among crews than as a formal record. For the men who flew the bombers over Europe, these stories served a specific and important psychological function. They were evidence that survival was possible, that skill and determination could overcome circumstances that the mathematics said were unsurvivable, that the man next to you, the man you flew with and slept next to and ate breakfast with in the gray English mornings, was worth trusting with your life. The crew of Lady's Courage flew together for 6 more missions after March 18 before the original crew was dispersed through the normal rotation of personnel. Carver completed his tour of duty, 25 combat missions, as required, in May of 1944 and returned to the United States. Several members of the crew went on to fly with other aircraft and other crews. Garrity's arm healed completely, O'Brien's shoulder required surgery, but he returned to flying status. Joseph Rains completed his tour of duty in June of 1944. He went home to Georgia, married, raised children and grandchildren, and lived to the age of 78. He never spoke much about the war in his later years, but his family knew the broad outlines of what had happened on March 18, 1944. They knew that a pilot named David Carver had chosen not to jump, and that because of that choice, Joseph Rains had lived. The 44th Bombardment Group, the unit that called shipped him home, the unit of which this crew was a part, went on to serve throughout the remainder of the European air campaign, flying missions until the final days of the war in Europe. They earned the nickname the Flying 8-Balls, painted on their aircraft alongside whatever other names and nose art the crews chose to mark their machines with. They lost men. They inflicted damage on the German war machine that contributed to its eventual defeat, and they produced, in the process, hundreds of individual stories of courage and competence and sacrifice, most of which were never recorded in any official document, most of which exist now only in the fading memories of those who lived them and the families to whom they were told. The belly landing of Lady's Courage on March 18, 1944, is one of those stories. A 23-year-old pilot, 9 men behind him, 130 miles per hour, a runway at shipped him in the cold Norfolk afternoon, and the decision to stay. History is full of moments like this, moments that never made the front pages of the newspapers, moments that were not captured in photographs or documented in the dispatches of war correspondents, moments known only to the men who lived them and the ground crews who watched and the families who were told, years later, what their fathers and brothers and sons had done on a particular afternoon in a particular place. During the greatest conflict in human history, the crew of Lady's Courage did not consider themselves heroes. They were doing their job. They were bringing each other home. That is what they would have told you, and they would have believed it completely. But what they did on March 18, 1944, the choices they made, the trust they placed in each other, the skill and courage and sheer determination that brought 10 men down alive in a crippled aircraft at 130 miles per hour, that was something more than a job. That was the best of what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line and the only currency that matters is what you are willing to do for the man beside you. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.